The stark quiet of room 312 is what draws her in, a stark contrast to the usual hustle of St. Jude's corridors. He lies still, a landscape of tubes and monitors, the only sound the rhythmic sigh of the ventilator. She doesn't know his name, only that he's been here for weeks, a silent fixture in her volunteer rounds. Today, instead of the usual chapter from a book no one will hear, a different impulse takes root. She finds herself leaning closer, her voice a mere breath. "I don't know if you can hear me," she whispers, the words feeling clumsy and sacred all at once. "But I hope you find your way back. I hope you find peace." A small, heartfelt prayer offered into the sterile air. And in that exact, vulnerable moment, the world explodes. Not with sound, but with blinding, successive flashes of light. The door, which she thought securely closed, is now a frame for shadowy figures and the unmistakable glint of camera lenses. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and if you believe love should feel like freedom, hit that like button and subscribe. She stumbles back, a gasp caught in her throat, her hand flying to her mouth. The prayer, so private, so tender, is now a public spectacle. He, the unknown man in the bed, is clearly someone important, someone whose quiet suffering is a story. And she, Eliza, a nobody who just wanted to offer a moment of comfort, is now caught in the glare. He had no idea who she really was, this man suspended between worlds, but the world, it seemed, was about to decide for itself who she was to him. And just like that, a whispered prayer in a silent room became a headline, and the man she'd only pitied became the center of her unwilling storm. Eliza had always sought refuge in the quiet interstices of life. Her small apartment, filled with more books than furniture, was a sanctuary. Her job at the local library, cataloging stories and shushing patrons with a gentle smile, was an extension of that peace. Volunteering at St. Jude's twice a week had been another way to find meaning in stillness, to offer a small, unobtrusive kindness. She'd read to a rotating cast of patients, elderly women who'd drift off to the sound of her voice, children whose parents needed a momentary reprieve, and occasionally, those like the man in 312, who offered no response at all. There was a unique solace in these one-sided conversations, a freedom in offering words without expectation. The hospital itself was a world she understood in textures and sounds. The squeak of a nurse's sneakers on linoleum, the hushed conversations at the nurse's station, the metallic tang of disinfectant overlaying the scent of wilting flowers. Her preferred companion on these volunteer days was a thermos of her own slightly too strong coffee and a well-worn copy of whatever classic she was currently revisiting. Sometimes, a particularly friendly nurse, a woman named Martha with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, would share a knowing smile or a brief, whispered update about a patient's progress. Martha had been the one who'd simply nodded when Eliza had first gravitated towards room 312, her expression one of weary empathy for its occupant. The antagonist in Eliza's quiet life had always been an amorphous entity, the loneliness that sometimes crept in during long evenings, the occasional pang of unfulfilled dreams. But now, the antagonist had a face, the relentless, flashing eyes of cameras, the cacophony of shouted questions she'd barely registered as hospital security swiftly, if belatedly, intervened and ushered the press away. The source of this sudden, terrifying attention, she soon learned, was the man in the bed. A local news channel, whose broadcast she'd accidentally caught a glimpse of in the hospital waiting room a week prior while waiting for her shift to start, had done a brief segment on him. Julian Croft, a renowned architect, celebrated for his innovative, sustainable designs, who had collapsed suddenly at the sight of his latest ambitious project, a community arts center. The report had been respectful, focusing on his contributions to the city and the mystery surrounding his sudden illness. No scandal, just concern. Until now, the fragile peace Eliza had cultivated, the anonymity she cherished, felt irrevocably shattered. The prayer, an intimate offering, had been stolen, twisted into something it was never meant to be. She felt a blush of shame, then a surge of anger, followed quickly by a deep, unsettling fear. What had she stumbled into? The immediate aftermath of the camera flashes was a blur of apologies from flustered hospital staff and the firm, guiding hand of a security guard leading her to a small, private office. A hospital administrator, a stern woman with carefully styled hair and an air of controlled panic, had asked her a series of questions. Who was she? Why was she in Mr. Croft's room? Did she know him? Eliza, still trembling, had answered as honestly as she could, her voice barely above a whisper. She was a volunteer. She didn't know him. She was just offering a prayer. The administrator's expression had remained skeptical. The next day, her face, grainy, caught in that awful flash of light, looking wide-eyed and distressed, was on the front page of a local tabloid, a smaller, more sensationalist paper than the one she'd seen the news report on. Mystery Woman Prays at Architect's Bedside, the headline blared. The story was speculative, hinting at a secret relationship, a clandestine vigil. Eliza had wanted to disappear, to crawl into her book-lined apartment and never come out. Her carefully constructed quietude had been breached, and the thought of returning to the hospital, of facing anyone, was terrifying. Yet, a strange, unwilling tether now connected her to the silent man in room 312. Her simple act of kindness had, through no fault of his, entangled their narratives. A week later, Julian Croft opened his eyes. The world returned to him not in a rush, but in slow, hazy increments. Sounds first, muffled and indistinct, then the pressure of the bed against his back, the scratchiness of a tube in his throat. His first coherent thought was a profound, disorienting confusion. Where was he? What had happened? His family, his composed, ever-efficient sister, Amelia, and his quietly worried parents, were there, their faces a mixture of relief and exhaustion. They filled in the blanks, the collapse, the coma, the weeks of uncertainty. It was Amelia, a few days into his reawakening, who hesitantly brought up the incident. There was a woman, Amelia began, carefully choosing her words as Julian sipped water, his throat still raw. A volunteer. She was in your room, apparently praying for you, when some photographers managed to sneak in. Julian frowned, his memory a frustrating patchwork. Photographers? Why? You're still news, Julian, Amelia said softly. Especially with the new arts center groundbreaking on hold. She showed him the tabloid clipping, her expression apologetic. Julian stared at the blurry photo of the woman. Her face was mostly obscured by shadow and the angle, but he could see the shock in her wide eyes, the vulnerable curve of her mouth. Who is she? He asked, his voice raspy. Her name is Eliza Vance. The hospital says she's a regular volunteer. Reads to patients. Apparently, she didn't know you, just felt moved to pray. Amelia sounded unconvinced, or perhaps just wary. The family had been fending off intrusions for weeks. A strange feeling stirred in Julian. This woman, a stranger, had been caught in the crossfire of his public life. And her prayer, despite his agnosticism, the thought of it, offered in sincerity, touched a place in him that felt raw and untended. I'd like to thank her, he said, surprising Amelia, and perhaps himself. Julian, I don't know if that's wise, Amelia cautioned. The media is still sniffing around. Any contact could be misconstrued. But Julian, already chafing against the confines of his hospital bed and the well-meaning but suffocating concern of his family, felt a flicker of resolve. This Eliza Vance owed him nothing, yet she had given something, and paid a small price for it. He wanted to acknowledge that. Eliza had, with considerable trepidation, returned to her volunteer duties, though she now skirted room 312 like it was radioactive. Martha, the nurse, had offered a sympathetic smile and a quiet, he's awake, you know, asking questions. Eliza had mumbled something noncommittal and hurried away, her heart thumping. The thought of facing him, of him knowing about the photo, about her presumptuous prayer, was mortifying. Then came the formal, handwritten note, delivered by a hospital orderly. Asterisk Ms. Vance, I understand you were offering comfort during a difficult time. I would be grateful for the opportunity to thank you in person, if you are willing. Julian Croft. Star. Eliza read it 3 times. It was polite, formal. It wasn't a demand, but an invitation. Her first instinct was to decline, to scribble a polite refusal and retreat further into her shell. But then she looked at the tabloid photo again, tucked away in a drawer. She saw her own fear, but also, in the periphery, the still, unconscious form of Julian Croft. He had been vulnerable then, and she, in her own way, had become vulnerable because of him. Maybe, just maybe, a quiet, private thank you was all he intended. Their first meeting was orchestrated with a degree of caution that felt almost comical. Amelia Croft, a woman who radiated competence and a fierce protectiveness for her brother, met Eliza at the nurse's station. Her scrutiny was polite but intense. Mr. Croft is still recovering, Ms. Vance, Amelia said, her tone neutral. This meeting is at his insistence. We would appreciate discretion. Of course, Eliza murmured, feeling like a schoolgirl summoned to the principal's office. I don't want to cause any trouble. I never did. Julian was sitting up in a chair by the window when Amelia ushered her in. He looked paler, thinner than the robust architect from the news photos, but his eyes, a surprisingly warm hazel, were alert and focused on her. The room was blessedly free of photographers. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice still a little weak but clear. "Thank you for coming." "Mr. Croft," Eliza replied, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I'm glad to see you're better." An understatement of epic proportions. An awkward silence descended. Eliza found herself studying the pattern on the linoleum floor. "My sister told me about what happened," Julian began, gesturing vaguely towards the door. "The photographers. I'm truly sorry you were subjected to that because of me." "It wasn't your fault," Eliza said quickly, finally meeting his gaze. "I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, I suppose. Or the right place, depending on your perspective on prayer," she added, a small, self-deprecating smile touching her lips. A flicker of something like amusement softened his features. "I'm not sure what my perspective is on prayer these days," he admitted, "but I appreciate the sentiment. Sincerely." "I often read to patients who can't respond," Eliza found herself explaining, needing to fill the silence to make him understand. "It's usually quieter." "I can imagine," he said, a wry twist to his mouth. "My recovery, I'm told, has been anything but quiet for those around me." They talked for a little longer, stilted pleasantries mostly. Eliza found herself noticing small things, the way his hands, though still, seemed capable and strong, the slight furrow in his brow when he concentrated, the way his eyes held hers with an unnerving directness. He asked about her volunteer work, and she found herself describing her love of books, her quiet routine at the library. He listened intently, asking occasional questions that showed genuine curiosity. It was less an interrogation and more a conversation. A tentative, fragile one. When Amelia reappeared, signaling the end of the brief visit, Eliza felt a strange mixture of relief and an unexpected reluctance to leave. "Thank you again, Ms. Vance," Julian said, "for everything." "You're welcome, Mr. Croft. I wish you a continued recovery." As she walked away from room 312, Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The man was no longer just a silent figure in a bed or a tabloid headline. He was Julian, and he had kind eyes. Julian found himself thinking about Eliza Vance more than he probably should. There was a gentleness about her, a lack of artifice that was refreshing after years spent navigating the often performative world of architecture, clients, and public engagements. His sister, Amelia, remained wary. "She seems harmless enough," Amelia conceded after one of Eliza's subsequent, brief visits Julian had found himself requesting. "But the press is still out there, Julian. They'd love nothing more than to spin this into some sort of Florence Nightingale romance." "I'm aware of the press, Amelia," Julian said, a touch of impatience in his voice. "She's just a kind person. Is it so wrong to appreciate a bit of kindness?" Eliza's visits became a quiet punctuation mark in the otherwise monotonous days of his recovery. She'd bring him books from the hospital library, sometimes reading aloud if he felt tired, her voice a soothing melody. They talked about everything and nothing, his frustration with physical therapy, her amusing anecdotes about library patrons, their shared appreciation for old movies. She never asked about his collapse, about the intense pressure he'd been under with the Arts Center project, a project that now felt like a distant, burdensome dream. He, in turn, learned about her quiet life, her small circle of friends, her subtle, witty sense of humor that would peek out unexpectedly. He discovered she had a penchant for slightly burnt toast and an encyclopedic knowledge of obscure poets. She learned he had a surprisingly goofy laugh and a habit of sketching on any available surface when his mind was working through a problem. One afternoon, while she was reading a passage from A.P.G. Wodehouse novel, he found himself laughing, a genuine, unrestricted laugh that made his ribs ache pleasantly. Eliza looked up, a wide, delighted smile spreading across her face. "It's good to hear you laugh like that," she said softly. In that moment, looking at her, the hospital room seemed to fade away. There was just Eliza, with her intelligent eyes and the book held loosely in her lap. He felt a pull towards her, a sense of ease he hadn't experienced in a very long time. But the outside world, with its flashing cameras and speculative headlines, was always lurking. One day, a nurse, meaning well, mentioned, "Oh, Mr. Croft, there was another piece in the paper about your mystery angel. They're really running with that story." Julian saw the color drain from Eliza's face, her smile faltering. The ease between them vanished, replaced by a familiar tension. Later that day, after she'd left, looking more subdued than usual, Amelia found him staring out the window, a troubled expression on his face. "This can't be easy for her, Julian," Amelia said gently. "I know," he sighed. "I don't want her to be hurt by this. By me." The unspoken truth hung in the air. His life, even in recovery, was a public commodity, and anyone close to him risked being pulled into the vortex. He was beginning to care for Eliza, more than he wanted to admit. And that scared him, not for himself, but for her. He imagined her quiet, book-filled world, and then pictured the harsh glare of media scrutiny. They were incompatible. The pressure mounted. Julian's doctors began talking about his discharge, about returning home, about eventually resuming his work. The Arts Center board was eager for updates. Reporters still occasionally loitered near the hospital exits. Eliza, sensing the shift, the encroaching reality of his other life, began to visit less frequently, her excuses polite but vague. Julian understood. She was protecting herself, retreating to the safety of her anonymity. And a part of him, the part that cared for her, knew it was for the best. But another part, a selfish, yearning part, missed her presence, her quiet humor, the way her eyes would light up when she talked about a book she loved. He missed the feeling of normalcy she brought into his sterile, monitored world. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling physical therapy session, he found a small, anonymously left package on his bedside table. It was a new collection of poetry by one of his favorite contemporary poets, one he'd mentioned in passing to Eliza weeks ago. There was no note, but he knew. It felt like a goodbye. A gentle, considerate, Eliza-like goodbye. And it left an ache in his chest that had nothing to do with his physical recovery. The day before he was scheduled to be discharged, Amelia was helping him pack his few belongings. "Are you going to see her again?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral as she folded a shirt. Julian looked out the window at the bustling city below, a city that felt both familiar and alien. "I don't think so, Ames," he said quietly. "It wouldn't be fair to her." Amelia nodded slowly. "Perhaps you're right." But there was a hint of something unreadable in her eyes, something that might have been regret. Eliza had tried to return to her old routines, but they felt different now, tinged with a quiet melancholy. The library was still a sanctuary, but the silence sometimes felt heavier. She'd even stopped volunteering at the hospital for a while, the memories too fresh. She told herself it was for the best. Julian Croft belonged to a world she couldn't comprehend, a world of headlines and expectations. Their brief intersection had been an anomaly, a strange, unsettling interlude. She saw the news reports of his discharge, Julian Croft, looking remarkably well, waving briefly to the press before being whisked away in a black car. He was smiling, but to Eliza, who had seen the weariness in his eyes up close, it looked strained. A week later, she was shelving books in the biography section when she heard a familiar, hesitant voice. "Miss Vance?" "Eliza." Her heart leaped. She turned, a stack of books clutched to her chest like a shield. It was Julian. He looked out of place in the hushed aisles of the library, dressed in casual clothes that still somehow looked expensive, a slight awkwardness in his stance. "Mr. Croft," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Julian, what are you doing here?" I was in the neighborhood," he said, then winced slightly. "Okay, that's not true. I came to find you." Eliza's mind raced. "Is everything all right?" "Yes, mostly," he said. "I wanted to thank you for the book of poetry. It was very thoughtful." "You're welcome," she managed, her cheeks warming. An awkward silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken things. Patrons rustled newspapers nearby. "Eliza," he began, his gaze earnest, "I know things got complicated. With the media, with everything. And I understand why you pulled back." She nodded, unable to speak. "But," he continued, taking a small step closer, "I missed our conversations. I missed you." Her breath hitched. This was not what she had expected. "My life is a lot," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "And I'm still figuring out how to navigate it after everything. But the clearest thing to me, during all those weeks in the hospital, and even now, is that those moments with you, talking about books or just being quiet together, they were the most real moments I'd had in a very long time." Eliza finally found her voice. "Julian, your world. It's not my world. The cameras, the attention. I can't." "I know," he interrupted gently. "And I wouldn't ask you to. But what if? What if I wanted a bit more of your world and mine? What if I'm tired of the noise?" He looked around the quiet library, a small smile playing on his lips. "This is nice." Her carefully constructed defenses were crumbling. The fear was still there, a knot in her stomach, but beneath it, something else was stirring, a tentative, hopeful warmth. "I don't know what the future looks like, Eliza," he said, his voice softer now, more vulnerable than she'd ever heard it. "But I'd like to try to figure it out. With you. If you're willing." He wasn't offering her a fairy tale. He was offering her a possibility, fraught with uncertainty but anchored by a sincerity that resonated deep within her. She thought of her quiet apartment, her books, her slightly burnt toast. And she thought of Julian's kind eyes, his surprising laugh, the way he listened as if her words were the most important thing in the world. The truth was, her quiet world had felt a little too quiet since he'd left the hospital. The cameras had flashed in her face, exposing a private moment to the world, thrusting her into a story she hadn't chosen. But now, looking at Julian, standing amidst the comforting scent of old paper and bindings, she realized that perhaps that flash had illuminated something else entirely. A connection, improbable and unexpected, but undeniably real. She took a small, shaky breath. The fear hadn't vanished, but the hope was stronger. "Okay, Julian," she whispered, a tiny smile finally reaching her own lips. "Okay." He didn't rush forward, didn't make a grand gesture. Instead, his own smile widened, relief washing over his face, his hazel eyes crinkling at the corners. He simply held her gaze, a silent promise passing between them. The library was still quiet, the patrons oblivious, but for Eliza and Julian, the world had just shifted, settling into a new, hopeful alignment. He reached out, tentatively, and his fingers brushed hers over the stack of books she still held. A small, simple contact. A beginning. The path ahead would be complicated, she knew that. His past, his public life, wouldn't just disappear. But for the first time in a long time, Eliza felt a sense of rightness, a quiet conviction that this choice was hers to make. And it felt, surprisingly, like freedom. The path to healing was rarely straightforward, but perhaps, sometimes, it began with a whispered prayer and led, unexpectedly, to a shared quiet moment in a library aisle, and the promise of a story yet to be written, together. Thanks for watching. If you believe in second chances and real love, give this story a like and subscribe for more.